In this video, let's talk about legal authorities. Legal authorities. Well, as a lawyer, if a client comes to you with a legal question or a problem, how do you find the answer? What tools do you consult? What authorities would you consult? If you have experience in a particular field of law, you may know the answer to a question about that field off the top of your head. But there is an awful lot of law out there. And lawyers, even judges, don't know the answer to every legal question. What lawyers do know is how to find the answer. Now, broadly speaking, there are two types of legal authorities, two types of sources that you can consult. Primary sources, primary legal authorities, primary sources, and secondary sources. So we have primary sources and secondary sources. Now, primary sources are the law. They are the law. And because they are the law, we say that they are mandatory. Primary sources are the law, and they are mandatory. They're binding, assuming that you're in a jurisdiction that that law comes from. So primary authorities would include things like constitutions. A constitution is the law. It also includes treaties between nations. So again, this is mandatory for the parties that are signatories to those treaties. Executive orders. Executive orders are also law. And we also include in primary sources lots of other things like rules of procedure. So court rules of procedure. Rules of evidence. The rules of evidence that you're required to follow in court. Statutes. These are the laws that are passed by the legislature. And we also have regulations, ordinances. There are some other. Ordinances. All right, so these are all primary law. We also include in here case opinions. Case opinions. These are the opinions of the courts that rule on cases. We sometimes call this case law or common law. And again, all of these, including case law, these are the law. And so they are mandatory. They are binding, assuming, again, that you're in a jurisdiction that these apply to. All right, so this is binding authority. Now, secondary sources, on the other hand, secondary sources are different. Secondary sources, they are not the law. Right? They help explain and summarize the law. They are not the law themselves. They may talk about the law, but they are not the law. And because they are not the law, they are not mandatory. They are not binding. They are what we call persuasive authority. Persuasive authority. And some examples, let's talk about some examples of secondary sources. Secondary sources include things like treatises. Treatises are written explanations and discussions about a particular subject of law. A treatise is usually pretty systematic in how it identifies and discusses all of the sub-issues of the subject. You can kind of think of it as like an organized dissertation. And like a dissertation, it's usually pretty in-depth. All right, it's a dissertation on the subject. Another example of a secondary source is what we call a restatement. Restatements, well, you'll probably learn about restatements in contracts or torts. Restatements are a type of treatise on specific legal subjects. So, for example, the restatement of torts or the restatement of contracts. It's an attempt to gather the case law, the common law, on a particular subject from around the country that has developed over the years on that specific subject, and to put it into an organized written volume. Now, again, these are technically not the law. They're not the law because they're not actual court opinions, so they don't qualify as common law. And they weren't passed by the legislature or anything like that, so they're not statutes. But they are highly persuasive. And the reason they're so persuasive is because they're developed over many, many years with lots of input from legal scholars and attorneys, law professors, even judges. So that's what restatements are. Another example of a secondary source is what we call a legal encyclopedia. Legal encyclopedia. Legal encyclopedias are just like regular encyclopedias, except they only include information about legal subjects. Right? And then they give commentary and information on these subjects, and they do something that many secondary sources do, and that is provide citations to the real law, to the primary law. So secondary sources, not just legal encyclopedias, but secondary sources in general, they typically will point you to the primary sources that they are explaining and summarizing. And legal encyclopedias will always include citations to the primary sources, to the primary law that they are explaining. Another example of a secondary source is what we call a practice guide. Practice guide. Practice guides are secondary sources that are organized by subject, and as their name suggests, they're designed to help lawyers who are actually practicing in that area of law. So they provide step-by-step procedures, typically, for how to do a certain task that is commonly required for that area of law. And of course, they also usually include some interpretations and analysis of the law and citations to primary sources that they're explaining. Right? So for everything that they say, they usually have a citation to a primary authority. And the last secondary source that we'll talk about is law review. Law reviews are journals. We sometimes just call them journals. Law reviews are scholarly journals that include articles written by lawyers and law professors, sometimes even law students. And these articles analyze and critique the law, or at least developments in the law, or sometimes they even comment on what the law should be. Now, some journals are dedicated to a particular topic. So, for example, the Maritime Law Journal is dedicated to maritime law, and the Intellectual Property Law Bulletin, which is focused on intellectual property issues. But then others are more general in scope. Usually the ones that are just called Law Review, those are more general in scope and would include articles about any legal subject. So this is an overview of the legal authorities that you would encounter and that you might want to consult if you had a question from a client or a problem from a client. And you can find out more about these authorities, especially the secondary authorities, just by doing a search online and looking up legal treatises and restatements and reading more about them.